Okay, we just got to get going here. One of the books I'll be referring to briefly is The Vision of the Anointed by Thomas Sowell. So it's just another Thomas Sowell book, but this one is really good in terms of how to assess statistics and how not to. But we'll get to that. A couple of economic fallacies. I have a lot of them. We'll only mention a couple. One we already have, but it's worth mentioning again in fallacy form, and that's the zero sum idea. But there's two levels of this, and that's why I bring it up again. One is in how wealth is measured, and we've talked about that, the static versus dynamic analysis. But also, as a result of that, or a species of it, how tax cuts versus expenditures are discussed and deficits. And you always hear this. We can't afford a tax cut. And if we just give the rich back, and I'm like, where do I even start? It's not your money, and that's not how it either grows or contracts. None of what you just said makes any sense, but you get away with it because people don't learn economics anymore. In terms of tax cuts, real briefly, we're going to talk about something called the Laffer Curve. What this is a way of describing a law of diminishing returns or a crowding out effect of incentives and disincentives. So for example, if this bottom represents the tax rates going up from 0 to say 100, and this represents the revenues brought in, you're thinking, well, let's say my economy is made up of $100 trillion or something like, I don't know. Let's go with 100 billion. So I don't stretch anybody too much. Well, 10% of that would be, my brain's not working at all today, but 10 billion. 20% would be 20 billion, and 30%, you get the idea. You get to 80%, well, that would be 80 billion. That would bring in 80 billion, right? And the answer is no. And way before you get to 80 billion, you'd find out that the answer is no. Hopefully you would find that out. Now, why is that, though? What he represented here is that you get to a point, say, 30%, where it doesn't keep going up, it starts to come down. He drew this on a napkin in a restaurant in the 1970s as he was talking to a couple of, the guy's name is Arthur Laffer, it's named after him. And it, again, demonstrates a law of diminishing returns. It's a very common sense rule that applies to more than simply economics. Think of the simple illustration again of burger production on a grill in a crowded fast food kitchen. All my analogies came when I was 19 and 20, started to study this stuff for fast food because those are the kind of things I worked at, so that's the best I could do. But the stovetop has enough space to fry dozens of burgers at a time. But of course, more hands on deck makes for lighter work, and therefore you get more burgers out quickly. Let's put a second person on there. You put a third person on there, you make 30 burgers. I'm just picking numbers out of nowhere. More is more all the way up, right? No, because elbow room, you get the idea. And there'll be a law of diminishing returns that comes from a crowding out effect. We see this in other areas of life. It works the same here in terms of incentives at marginal rates of income as what am I going to do with this next dollar, this next whatever? How I am taxed in the fiscal policy of a nation is going to affect that. There's a great statement. Now, what's being attacked here? So this application of the zero-sum fallacy is that as since I have X amount, the 100 billion, if I keep taxing at X amount, I get X revenue all the way up. And the answer is no, and the reason that answer is no is that how much you tax them then determines how much of an actual total pie. It's not 100 billion, now it's 500 billion, and so forth. So this shows up in annual debates. We can't afford a tax cut, or a tax cut. Where do we spend this money? Do we spend it on military? Do we spend it on this? Or do we give tax cuts to them or tax cuts to the rich? Okay, it's not the government's money to begin with. You're talking about a rate reduction, less that the government will collect from the sources of all of their funds. So a lot of problems there. But John F. Kennedy in 1960 made a statement about this. He was a supply sider just like Reagan. Kennedy and Reagan understood this. They were the ones that were anti-communist as well. They were the ones that were shot as well. Oh, I better not go too fast. But Here's what Kennedy said. Get over your shock. Here's what Kennedy said. Let this shock you too. He said, quote, "It is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now. Cutting taxes now is not to incur a budget deficit, but to achieve the more prosperous, expanding economy, which can bring a budget surplus." I've got another parable for that, the parable of the credit card at the lunch counter. I'll bring that in a little bit later as well. But what Kennedy is saying is that the best way to get higher revenues into the treasury is to lower the rates. That's counterintuitive. You're covering the spigot from which I, as the government, am drawing my funds. Wait a minute. Counterintuitive, right? Well, if you believe that the government is what creates wealth and that wealth is the government's property, that might be counterintuitive to you. But actually, by incentivizing productivity, you have a bigger pie in each successive fiscal year, and therefore more money tends to flow in. We'll show this in all different kinds of ways. There's also a fallacy called the broken window fallacy. And the broken window fallacy was first popularized by Henry Hazlitt in his Economics in One Lesson. It was already told by Bastiat in the Law, or some other writing. Maybe it was in the Law. But anyway, the broken window fallacy is essentially, okay, so a hoodlum throws a rock through the window of a tailor in his business. And a mob starts to form. But no worries, because that mob is made up of a bunch of Keynesians. And so they get the bright idea that, well, let's look at this at the glass half full. No, the glass is broken, but you get the idea. The glassmaker now is 1 unit more in business. So you actually added to the economy because now the glassmaker is more in business by this 1 unit. The problem with that, though, is that the tailor's product was a real gain, which he now has to shift in his productivity by however small amount, butterfly effect, but it still is reality. And so that tailor and his product that was a real gain, and the replacement of the glass window is now in a competition. So the replacement of the divot there is a redistribution. That is a real contraction to the economy. Now that same fallacy happens in war, that war is good for business. And you say, well, who would ever believe that? But that shows up in statistics, for example, in the 1940s with massive expansion rates during the Roosevelt administration. And you can look at that and say, well, the New Deal worked. No, it didn't. It was a wartime economy that was foisted upon things once the New Deal was not working. And I don't want to get into conspiracy theories there about Roosevelt's motives, but just the numbers, if you compare the 30s to the 40s, will show that. But what's behind that is the broken window fallacy. I know I'm going fast, but I have to cover all this stuff. There are other fallacies of false abstractions and reifications that go into charts, protectionist fallacies. Read Gilder and Friedman for those two, exports good, imports bad, protect the worker, protect the dollar, etc. Read Friedman's Free to Choose and you'll be helped out with that. But I want to just dovetail off of this one and talk about the expenditure, the tax cut as an expenditure fallacy. And the two main flavors of that are we can't afford these tax cuts and tax cuts for the rich. Well, I'm for a tax cut. I just don't want to give that to the rich, to give that. Rewind that until the pennies drop. But anyway, this is a good place to explain not only the difference between deficits and debts, but also between my money and your money, because apparently that's not straight right now. Okay, and the parable that I told back in the day was the parable of the credit card. I think it was the first one I ever came up with at age 18 to explain this to somebody. And of course you have money, you bring it to the lunch counter, you get a pizza or whatever they give you at the cafeteria at school. I said, suppose, for example, that I gave you my credit card for 5 days, for a whole week. And you could charge what you want. Well, no, sorry, I give you a limit. I give you whatever it was, a $5 limit on that. And then at the end of the week, you come back with my credit card and you hand it to me and say, oh, thanks so much for that. But, I had to charge, $10 per day. And so naturally I'm $50 over the credit line you gave me. Here's your card back, but you owe me $50. And naturally, after slapping you in the head, I would say, I'm sorry, what? I owe you $50? You owe me $50. But when you hear that tax cuts, say in the 1980s, incurred X deficit coming from the tax and spend liberals, that is exactly what the American taxpayer was being told at the end of the 80s. Now, first of all, there is a difference between deficit and debt. The deficit is, in that credit card parable, the daily amount you were charging over, and the debt is the total accumulated, now owed, as simply as we can make it. Okay, so there's the difference there. We're going to come back to that. I'm telling it now. We'll give the statistics in just a little bit. Finally, there's the Robin Hood fallacy. I'm only giving the most popular ones. The Robin Hood fallacy. Now, this is a test for our progressive neighbors. The Robin Hood fallacy is obviously, you rob from the rich and give to the poor. That the poor are you're actually robbing from the rich to begin with, and that you are, instead of their competitors in the upper middle class from competing and expanding the economy, and that you're actually giving to the poor and helping their lives. I'm not talking about the historical Robin Hood, which you've messed that up too. I'm talking about the actual fact that you believe that that's real. But let me give a test for our progressive neighbors. Let's assume that the helping the poor part was real. Let's assume that you actually could extract that money from the rich, that it would not be filtered through the bureaucracy to grow it, but that the poor actually got that money. So I'm going to take all of that off the table. Let's say that all that actually happened. What if I can show you that every time the rates are cut for the top tax bracket, they instantly pay dramatically more in taxes? Would you be interested? Because remember, I thought you wanted to help the poor because you love people and think that we're selfish and hate them. But what if I could show you that if you lower the tax rate on the upper percentage, every single time they pay dramatically more in taxes, therefore you take in more receipts into the treasury and you have a lot more money to help them. Because your motive, of course, is to help the poor, right? And that conversation kind of stops right there, usually. Let me give you a news flash, though. The richest don't pay taxes. They pay accountants and lawyers to avoid all that if you so incline them. By the way, there's a reason why, and I noticed this in the 90s with Ted Turner and even the early days of Bill Gates and so forth, and Warren Buffett and the rest. Why are the richest of the richest always, without exception, registered Democrats? That's odd, because I thought the richest of the rich would all be capitalist pigs, with that smokestack going up that I had in the picture before. Odd. Well, this is one reason right there. They don't like the competition once their yachts are the ones that dominate the seas. Well, Gilder gives us a principle. He says, quote, highly progressive tax rates do not redistribute incomes. They redistribute taxpayers from taxable to untaxable activities, tax-free shelters, etc., etc. You're going to disincentivize them from having their yachts out there, sticking with the yachts analogy. They're going to pull them ashore and save the riches they already have. Okay? Now that's even just laying aside their bad motives, which we'll get to that in a few weeks. But what became called supply-side economics by the end of the 1970s was on the one hand fueled by the evident failure of Keynesianism in what was called the stagflation of that decade of the 1970s. They actually had to come up with a new name for how bad that combination of inflation and poor productivity and recession was. They called it stagflation. Yet on the other hand, there was an equally evident failure of those in the party of Reagan to really understand the alternative when the 1980s had started. People forget Nixon had said, we're all Keynesians now. They tried to prevent Goldwater in 1964 and Reagan in 76, and then again they tried in 80 to stop them from getting the party's nomination. They were not supply-siders. They were as much socialists. They were called Rockefeller Republicans by people like Pat Buchanan, if we remember that phrase. They did not understand nor agree with, in any sense, Reagan on those issues. You might recall also that it was George Bush Sr. who in the 1980 primaries, when he was running against Reagan, who coined the term voodoo economics. That was George Bush that invented that term. He never learned it, by the way, as we'll see, when he became president. He never came to agree with it. He just went along with it as vice president. And so what became known Reaganomics, or the main slice of misunderstanding, what became called trickle-down economics. And it's a very unfortunate phrase that even the Reagan team used. Jack Kemp would use it in the 1996 election, and Al Gore was ready for it with this cheap rhetorical response, which we can get into. But it's a very unfortunate phrase because it played into the way that Keynesians and the public hears and understands it. It demonstrates an utter misconception of all the relevant categories. But at any rate, before getting into the empirical evidence, let me bring in one more category of concern, and that's alleviating poverty. And very simply put, let me say it this way. If wealth is the production of marketable goods, poverty is its absence. So let's just stay really simple. Intuitively then, the best solution to poverty, one would think, is more wealth, right? Unfortunately, Marxism has taught people that increased wealth is the cause of poverty. And again, that's that same mercantilist presupposition, zero-sum game. Increased wealth is what causes poverty in their mindset. And Keynesians gave authoritative class credibility to the idea that redistributing wealth without the bloody revolution, we'll do it peacefully, could equal the playing field. And so you start with that fallacious presupposition, you get the idea that if wealth is going up, so is poverty. That's the direct relationship. Well, Thomas Sowell gives us a model for assessing the war on poverty that started in the 1960s, and really public policy in general, but he applies it to the war on poverty in his book, The Vision of the anointed class being the elites, the intellectuals that are going to solve everything for us. And he brings this in different stages. Stage one is the crisis. The crisis. Something is called a crisis. Sowell says, even though all human situations have negative aspects, and even though evidence is seldom asked or given to show how the situation at hand is either uniquely bad or threatening to get worse. Sometimes the situation described as a crisis has in fact already been getting better for years. Okay? So the anointed, the elites, the anointed as he calls them, calls something a crisis, even though in most cases that situation is either normal natural pattern and in many ways getting better up until the point of the crisis when, stage two, the solution. By the way, guess who's the solution? These guys are the solution. He says, in stage two, policies to end the crisis are advocated by the anointed, who say that these policies will lead to beneficial result A. Critics say that these policies will lead to detrimental result Z. The anointed label these latter claims as absurd and simplistic, if not dishonest. Stage three, the results. The policies are instituted and lead to detrimental result Z. Okay? So, bad result. Okay? So they say good result. The critics say, no, this is going to happen. So we'll just say, this happens. The X. Trying to make this super simple. And then stage four, finally, the response. And much like, and Sowell didn't use this analogy, but you could easily use the analogy of a cult, one of those 19th century cults that makes a prophecy of the end of the world, doesn't come true, and then it's reinterpreted, and so forth. Okay, so that's really what's going on here. The response, Sowell says, quote, the burden of proof is put on the critics. No burden of proof whatsoever is put on those who had so confidently predicted the improvement. Indeed, it is often asserted that things would have been even worse were it not for the wonderful programs that mitigated the inevitable damage from other factors. By the way, that's happened. That's exactly what's happening in the virus situation right now. 15 days to flatten the curve. And then that happens, you reinterpret the data and say, but it would have been so much more people would have died if you weren't wearing that and so forth. What's your empirical evidence of that? And the goalpost shifts every time it doesn't work out. But that's science, so they tell us. Okay, and the same thing has been going on for years. It's a standard trick of the anointed. You see, there's an irrelevance of evidence here. When self-congratulations for good intentions are at stake, no amount of empirical data can be allowed to confuse things. But one of the things we want to say is that empirical data matters for love of neighbor. If you say you do, the results will matter. Well, what's going on here is the nature of disincentivizing human economic motion. What's going on in these wrong approaches to poverty is not treating people as human actors. Think of the attributes of full welfare requirements. Okay? We want to start making a moral argument against socialism. We want to make a moral argument against Keynesian economic policies. We want to say that if you're pro-life and pro-this and pro-this and those social issues, that those same commitments and values make you against Keynesian economics. It's all of one cloth. Okay? The quality for welfare. What are the attributes of welfare? Okay? Let's simplify. You want to qualify for welfare. This is going back to the Great Society, the 1960s. A person must have limited to no assets, no other breadwinner, no livable source of income, and more children. In short, if you want to check, close your accounts, don't get married or get divorced, don't get a job, and have more kids out of wedlock. A more strategic program to bury people in permanent poverty can hardly be imagined. It looks an awful lot. Now, when you put it like that, and then add 40 years of data showing that that's exactly what's happening, I do not any longer question your intelligence. I had been questioning that for a long time. I now question your sincerity. Because if you're one of the people that knows better, you have a responsibility to look at that and saying, not only is that not working as the critics said, but the opposite is happening as the critics predicted. If I really love these people, I should probably try something else, anything. Okay? The empirical record of all these areas we just talked about. Let's first start at the size and scope of the public sector. In the United States, government spending from 1800 to 1929 did not exceed 12% of the national income. Okay, let's erase everything else. We'll come back to those. We'll see the stages play out. Now we're just to put the visual. But mostly I just want to look at 1900. So we're going to shorten that on purpose. 1900, and we're going to go to, where we are now. But even there, we'll probably stop the data, most of it right about there. I only put that up as a visual because one of the things I learned teaching history is that people they have no visual for like a timeline. So a lot of our problems is people can't even visualize where things are being located. So the propagandist has easy shell game wiggle room there, just in something like that. But anyway, government spending from 1800 to 1929 did not exceed 12% of the national income. So in this first level, I love it when markers don't work, government spending, okay, that was very low, 12% of national income. Now you'd say, you're going to mix the way GNP versus GDP, so we'll just say national income. We'll just put the word income there, all right? Let's never use that again. 2/3 of that was spent by state and local governments, mostly for schools and roads, as late as 1928. And so of that, let's just put a pie chart. This amount was federal, and then this amount was state and local. I realize I have to do that for time's sake. Sorry, so I just hope you're paying attention. So as late as 1928, this is the case. Okay, that much of the national income is government spending, and that much of it is federal. So very, very, that's a horrible thing. So you're saying 5 minutes left, or is it 20?
We're at 25.
Okay. All right. So So we fast forward past that. People don't care as much about that. But I bring that statistic up. In 1928, approximately 10% of national income was spent by the public sector, 3% of that at the federal level, the rest of the state. 50 years later, in 1978, 40% by the public sector. So by 1978, 40% of that is by the public sector. And how much of that? 25% of that, let's put that, is at the federal level. That's at state and local. But this is all public versus private. Okay, so that gives you a taste of how much we became socialist between 1928 and 1978. But notice the principle there, that with the growth of the government's role comes a shift in power toward the central state. Again, Friedman's point about the link between economic and political liberty. Your churches are being pressed right now because of socialism. Wait, what? Because of Keynesianism, now your church doors are being banged on by the blue helmets because of Keynesian economics. What? Yeah, that's the connection. Figure it out. Okay? So this is just an introduction to it. The New Deal's failure. In October 1929 to January 33, the economy was recovering. The U.S. gold stock was rising. The New Deal created the Great Depression. Capitalism did not. From 1933 to 1942, in those 10 years of the New Deal, the beginning of it, saw unemployment rise from, where are we? We're right here, 33, let's just go 42. In other words, the Great Depression, the 10 years of the New Deal, that saw unemployment rise from 6.4% to 17.6%. That's unemployment during the New Deal expenditures. Total failure. Is that why Roosevelt got us into the war? I'm not going to go there yet. The war on poverty. Remember Sowell's pattern of failure. I did take it down. I understand that. Applied to the war on poverty. He said, quote, its stated purpose was a reduction of dependency, not simply the provision of more material goods to the poor. It was the language of Johnson and Kennedy, not any Republican, that spoke of a hand up, not a hand out. They were aware of the objection, and they confidently promoted this safety net as just that, something designed to be temporary, while an economy and those at the bottom recovered. Kennedy saw it as including rehabilitation and job training so that public money would even be saved within a decade. And the day that Johnson signed the Economic Opportunity Act in 1964, he declared, quote, the days of the dole in our country are numbered. In short, the selling point was that this targeted welfare would end welfare in a generation. Clearly, that's not what happened. As conservatives like Barry Goldwater predicted, their counterclaim, remember option Z as Sowell called it, their claim was that this would incentivize unemployment and incentivize government dependence. The argument we would ratchet that up now is to say they're doing that on purpose and they're using minorities and purposely destroying their families. The rates of black business owning after slavery to the 1920s was rising at a higher percentage than for whites. The intact families of blacks between World War II and 1964 was higher for blacks than among whites. The divorce rate higher among whites than blacks. And in 1964, the socialist state aimed to crush black America, hook them up to the government plantation, and then yell at anybody who called them on it as a racist and a hater of the poor, when in fact they were deliberately destroying the people to create a permanent voter class and slave class for their power on the backs of the people they claimed to represent. Crisis revisited. As Sowell said, between 1950 and 1960, the amount of those below the poverty line was cut in half because of the post-war prosperity. And the Kennedy tax cuts implemented in 1964 would have surely soaked up unemployment and low standards of living the rest of the way. But then the Great Society was promoted. One could have said in 1964, yes, poverty exists, we should want it reduced. Wealth production is doing that. Wealth transfer will do the opposite. It'll kill our chance at that. Wealth transfer will disincentivize that same trend, and it will incentivize its opposite. So the third stage that Sowell brings up, results, rinse, repeat, and reinterpret. And yell at anybody as a racist who dares to call you on it. By 1992, more people were both dependent on the government and below the poverty line than when the program began. The number of people receiving public assistance more than doubled from 1960 to 1977, and in that same time, the price of public housing rose fivefold. Last statistics I'll throw at you, the amount spent on food stamps rose more than tenfold. All government-provided in-kind benefits increased from about eightfold from 1965 to 69, more than 20-fold by 1974, and the government spending on it from 8% of the GNP in 1960 to 16% in 1974. So, in short, it not only failed, it had the exact opposite effect that Goldwater and others predicted. When we come back next time, we'll defend supply-side economics in the 1920s, 60s, and 80s and show you how the Keynesian is wrong about everything.